have to verify.
Okay.
Uh-huh. Okay, great. Now,
I'm actually.
let's see. Let me see the audio. Okay, let's try again when the speaker is with us.
No, no.
Okay.
Spiritually or
Okay, we need to verify when the speaker is with us. For now, is here. And what else? Our children doing? They are also related. The Math Mondays also in school. Oh, they are the middle school.
Bradley's at Ward Melville, which is high school, but Catherine's in ninth grade. She's technically a freshman. She's in
Okay.
She's a freshman in high school, basically. Yeah, she has a bad cold, so I dropped her off at school on my way here. She's been most of the day at home.
So we have everything done. I'm going to return the exams. Lauren Hullingham. I'm with Ray. Don't worry.
no one speaks.
It's literally or Saturday. Make it up.
So too Saturday. Yeah.
We're used to it. What's scary?
His state of the union. That's first.
I mean, doesn't the records in the White House have to record every tweet a president makes? So didn't they have to record all of?
Transcribe.
Yeah, they had to transcribe all of Trump's tweets.
There's also people who just don't sign independent. There are
Like, imagine being like going to school for it. The stenographers, they know their own language. I think that's cool. Like each stenographer has their own language, so only they can decode the case.
It's definitely.
Yeah, it's called like steno. Basically, they don't type it word for word. They do it based on how it is short.
But basically quick, right?
That's why they can type something. So that's why it's like not just anyone. I don't know if it's still. I'm telling you, it's crazy. Just like technically from where I asked the question, the judge can say it's like from there.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're loud.
Uh-oh, we can't hear you. Are you on mute?
Oh,
Am I on?
Okay, let's see. Now,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
You can hear
I'm
me now.
but
So we need more boost for volume.
let's see if
What?
we can change this.
pretty sure mine's on.
Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. It's a sandwich.
You don't hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. I hear you.
What happened?
I mean, technically.
My mic is supposed to be working.
Okay, it's working. I can hear you, but we want to get your sound coming
Louder.
out of the room speakers instead of out of this small speaker in the front of the room.
Okay.
So let us, why do we always,
Let's try. Yes, because
Have
usually it's with this system. But could you please keep talking with him?
okay. We're going to get started just as soon as we sort out the audio. Can you give us another, let us hear you?
Yes. Hear me?
Uh.
No?
Can we hear you? Professor Wray?
I don't know if you can hear me. I can hear you.
Okay. Why? System. Try another.
How come, where did he go? He's gone from the screen.
Oh, yeah. No.
Okay, so
Right.
now we have him. Do you hear me?
Yes,
You hear me and we hear nothing from you now.
I don't know. I tested my mic. It works. Works.
The third one doesn't work. No,
When I thought it was always the first check mark on both.
it is weird because usually,
I thought it was always the first check mark.
yes. But now, for example, we cannot listen anything if it says something.
You still don't hear me?
What happens is the mic has a speaker, so that's the default. So it'll like switch over to using the mic.
Who's this mic?
Yeah, that
Maybe.
Do we have you now, Professor Ray? Try one more time.
I hear you, but there's,
What do you think?
one. There's a volume.
I did. I cranked it all the way up.
Yeah.
I
Here
think-
too.
seems like maybe feedback? No.
But no, they can. I don't think they can listen.
No, they
voice
can't hear from the
that
back.
back.
Okay, everyone, we're gonna try to start, but let's see how quiet we can get it because we might need to be able to hear from up here. Hopefully
Yeah.
not.
I can one from. What do you think? We're not lose too much time.
If they can be here fast.
Okay, let me try. Yes.
Okay,
All right, we're gonna get some technical help.
okay.
We always have to fumble a little bit, but usually he figures it out.
Okay.
I'll let you have a little peek at the class. There are about 50 students enrolled, just so you can kind of see. It will look like you're not talking to very many because they avoid sitting right in the middle, but there are lots of them here.
Okay.
Okay,
For some reason I have Wolfie chat. Can I close Wolfie chat?
I would think so. Yeah,
Whoops. Am I gone? No.
nobody can think of a way to get this. What is this? Why is this muted? Try again. Try talking to us
Yes.
again.
I'm talking.
Yeah, all right. He'll be back up here in just a minute. Where are you? Are you at home in Oregon?
I'm at Levy.
You're at Levy. Oh, you could have just come down.
I think it's going to take time.
Who knew?
Maybe not. I had to teach yesterday till 5:30. So
Okay.
no. And I had to do a podcast this morning.
Okay. Let's try. Once
Sorry
again.
about this.
Yeah.
What podcast did you do this morning?
Christian and
Oh, no volume. I mean, now I have no sound.
okay.
Maybe we should just wait until someone gets here.
Yeah.
I will just make sure share screen is working while we're. Does that work? You can't hear me at all? I can't hear you now.
No.
Now you can hear me?
I can hear you.
All right.
Okay. So let's begin.
Did you go down and ask someone?
No,
to
I
come
was
up?
trying to call, but
Oh,
I didn't
to
answer.
Okay.
So I have to go down.
All right. So what we're going to ask you to do is start and speak close to your microphone and as loud as you can. And we're going to go down and try to get somebody to come in. And if we have to stop to improve the sound, we'll have to interrupt you. I'm very sorry.
Yes.
Oops. Okay. Well,
Okay, so everybody's been introduced to you. I'm not going to take any time. We've already lost time for that. I'm just going to say thank you for joining us. And then I'm going to back out of the camera and let you go.
well, you could just repeat what I say.
If you
Yell.
prefer,
Yell it
I could.
loudly. No. Can they hear me at all? I turned
Yeah,
up.
yeah. Even in the far back of the room, they're nodding yes.
All right. I have the volume all the way up. I don't think I have share screen on right now, so let me do that. Okay, you can see that?
Yep.
All right, let me begin with Minsky's earliest work in the 1950s. His professor was Joseph Schumpeter, who's well known for his theory of innovation, how firms respond to profit opportunities to innovate. Minsky applied that to the financial sector. So he said banks, just like any other kind of firm, will respond to profit opportunities by innovating. So he looked at some specific financial innovations of the late 50s. No reason for us to go through those. His argument was that unlike innovation in the non-financial sector, what innovation in the financial sector does is that it stretches liquidity. So you can think of holding less and less very safe assets and cash. And in the case of banks, what they're doing is holding a smaller and smaller amount of reserves and government bonds as safe assets in order to increase lending and increase profits. He argued this will increase the fragility of the financial system and reduce the margins of safety, which you can think of as just a margin of error, so that smaller and smaller problems can have bigger and bigger impacts on the financial system. When these innovations finally do lead to financial crisis, he argued that in the post-war period, we're going to have an intervention by the government in order to save the financial system that will validate those innovations because they don't lead to losses. And so those innovations will remain even though they had led to a crisis, because what the financial markets will learn is that the government is always there to back you up. He also did some work on the multiplier accelerator model. We don't need to go through that. The idea here is that it could be shown that in one of these Keynesian type models, the time path of the economy, so as it's growing, it could be a nice steady growth, or you could have cycles. You could have very wild cycles with booms and depressions. And Minsky's contribution to this was to argue that the time path of the economy as it grows could be more or less stable depending on the institutions in the economy. And what he was arguing is that the kinds of institutions we had in the early post-war economy promoted stability. But he argued that stability is destabilizing. This is his most famous quote. So the idea is that the stability will encourage greater and greater innovations that stretch the liquidity, that increase the risk of a crisis, but you know that if there's a crisis, the government's going to intervene. So he was predicting all of this in the late 50s when we had a very robust financial system where we were growing on a very stable growth path. But he said that's not going to last because behavior will change in a way that will make the system more unstable. So in the 60s and 70s, he developed his most famous idea, which is the financial instability hypothesis. And what he was doing was building on the work of Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. Minsky's first book was 1975, and the title was John Maynard Keynes. The idea was that what he was doing was adding to Keynes a financial theory of investment. So what Keynes had given us was an investment theory of the cycle. For the economics students, you learned that the Keynesian theory is that it's fluctuations of investment that cause the business cycle. But Minsky said that what Keynes did not have was a theory of how investment gets financed. And so that's what Minsky was going to add to the Keynesian model, financing investment. So he talked about how investment can be financed and how over time the financial situation of firms would be encouraged to become more risky. So he argued that when we come out of the Great Depression, everyone remembers how bad that was. Nobody wants that to happen to them. And so they take on very little debt. When they go into debt, they want to ensure their income flows are greater than their outflows, that is servicing their debt in every period. So they expect to have enough income flow to cover both the interest payments and the principal payments in every period. That's a very safe financial position to be in, okay? But if the economy is growing steadily.
I hate to do this, but we have our technicians here. Could you give us just a second to work on the audio? Thank you.
So the question option should be usually there, but if it's not there, we have to restart the system for it to show up again. Would you like to do that?
No.
Or would you like to keep going?
We would like to keep going.
Okay.
Thank you.
If usually it should be the crestron option that, Mhm. And if
It
it's
is not
not
there.
there, yeah, it happens, and then we have to just restart the system.
Okay,
Okay,
So,
so there is a way to write the volume more?
is this the highest?
Yeah, this is the highest. And we don't have more. Try that. No.
I think I boosted it all the way.
Then I
Okay,
think this is the
so
highest
that's
I can
it.
go.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
well,
Sorry
thank
about
you.
that.
All right, thanks.
Bye-bye.
Also, the aircon is over there, the black one on the wall. You can just pick it up and then it'll.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you. All right.
Okay.
Because it's gonna get,
All right. So if the economy is growing and almost all investment is successful, some will be encouraged to take riskier positions. So the next kind of profile, Minsky called speculative, and that would be a position in which your income flows are enough to cover interest, but they're going to have to go up in order for you to be able to cover the principal. This is a little bit riskier. If your income flows decline, you won't even be able to pay the interest. And that is when you get into trouble. Okay. But if the economy is growing, many of these will turn out to be okay because income will grow and you'll still be able to pay the interest plus start paying off the principal. All right. The final position is called Ponzi, named after a famous Ponzi scheme fraudster. In a Ponzi position, your income flows are not enough even to pay interest. So you have to borrow to pay interest. Usually you will get into this kind of a position because you were in a speculative position, but your income flows fall. You can also get in this position if the interest rates go up. So you have to pay more interest. Either things have to get better or a Ponzi position is going to go bad. The lenders will stop lending to you and you're going to become insolvent. So anyway, the idea is that over the course of the cycle, we will get more and more of these riskier positions so that the economy becomes more exposed to a financial crisis. Okay. However, in the post-war period, we have the institutions that put ceilings and floors on the economy. So a ceiling will stop a speculative bubble, a floor will stop a financial crash, so that you can try to grow the economy within the ceilings and floors. The most important ceilings and floors are put in place by what he called the big government. Here he's talking about fiscal policy, and the big bank, which is the central bank, the Fed in our case. These will try to help keep the growth path within a ceiling and floor so that we don't have runaway expansions and we also don't have deep recessions. The problem is, again, stability is destabilizing. So if these institutions are successful, they will encourage more risk-taking so that the economy becomes more fragile and a deep recession and financial crisis becomes more possible. So the idea is apparent stability changes expectations and behavior in a way that generates fragility. He said that when you create a theory of the economy and the way the economy works, you have to take into account that the people in the economy also have a view about the way the economy works. And they will take account of the fact that you have a big government and a big bank that will intervene to help you if things go bad, and you will change your behavior in a way that makes it more likely things will go bad. Okay, so that's the financial instability hypothesis. Minsky favored, and this is very early work, and then even in the 1950s, he favored government-led expansions because government, unlike the private sector, is always able to service its debts. So he argued that government-led expansion supports strong private balance sheets. He referred to the experience of World War II, where the government ended the war with a debt ratio of 100% of GDP. All of that government debt was held in the private sector. And so that helped to support private balance sheets because it gave them very safe assets to hold. On the other hand, an investment-led expansion is inherently more unstable because it's subject to the kind of instability that I just talked about. So that was his theory in the early 1980s. I was a student at Minsky, and I asked him, well, what about a consumer-led expansion, where instead of firms borrowing to finance investment, what if consumers are borrowing to finance consumption? Would that also be unstable? And he said, yes, that also could be a path to instability. So I'm bringing that up now because it'll come back later. Okay. When Minsky talked about the big bank being a lender of last resort, he argued that's the primary purpose of the central bank. It's not to control the money supply. It's not to control inflation, which is a big topic because the Fed is probably going to raise interest rates next week, thinking that it's their job to fight inflation. Minsky always argued, no, that's not really the central bank's job. Central bank's job is to be the lender of last resort. So the central bank will step in if a financial crisis gets started in order to prevent what he called the debt deflation process, where all the financial institutions have to try to sell off their debt in order to cover their own debts. So they're selling assets to cover their own debts. So that's what a lender of last resort does. It steps in to stop that. The problem with doing that is if you know the central bank is only going to step in and try to help you, you'll take greater risks. So the other side of the coin is that if the central bank is going to be the lender of last resort, bail out the system in bad times, it's going to have to regulate the system to prevent financial institutions from doing the riskiest stuff. So you have to supervise their balance sheets, tell them what they can do and what they cannot do. Okay. Minsky, unlike virtually every other theory of the business cycle and of financial crises, is that these are natural. A crisis, financial crisis, deep recession, doesn't hit you because of a sunspot. That was the old Jevons view from the 19th century. It isn't due to government intervention into the economy. It isn't even due to bad apples, that is, fraudsters. It's not due to individual bad behavior. It's natural to the system. So the crises are not due to specific characteristics, bad apples. It's that they emerge out of the normal profit-seeking activities of borrowers and lenders. So the system evolves from a robust financial structure to a fragile one, just out of normal profit-seeking behavior. Okay, so they are natural. You don't see these as shocks to the system. Okay, just a few more words on Minsky's views of the sovereign government, the United States government. Can that become Ponzi? Well, in the early 50s, he wrote, there is no default risk on national government-owned currency debt. So as long as US government bonds are issued in US dollars, there's no default risk. He also said only the national government debt represents net financial wealth. So all the private credits and debits cancel out Okay, so for every private creditor, there's a private debtor. Once we cancel all of that out, what is left is the government's debt. So that is the net financial wealth of the private sector. You've probably heard that before in your class. He argued that a growing economy requires a budget deficit. So there's nothing wrong with having a budget deficit. He actually argued that a growing economy needs one. He argued that government spending led expansion is less fragile. I already explained that one. And then finally, he said, in the 1960s, we do face a constraint, and that is the Bretton Woods system, in which the US government promises to exchange dollars for gold. But when President Nixon went off gold, he said, we removed that cross of gold. He removed the final constraint on government spending. We don't have to worry about our gold stock anymore. Now there really is no financial constraint on the government, okay? Cross of gold refers to William Jennings Bryan, who went around the country in the 19th century saying, don't crucify my people on a cross of gold. He was against the gold standard, okay? All right, so I've been talking about what Minsky is best known for, which is his financial instability hypothesis. But if you look at his work in the 60s through the mid 70s, he did just about as much work on poverty and unemployment. And Stephanie and I wrote a paper looking at that early work. Until we did that, people didn't really know he had written so much on this topic. So anyway, we explored his writings on the Kennedy-Johnson War on Poverty, which Minsky said is going to fail. It's not going to reduce poverty. What was it missing? He said, it's missing a commitment to full employment. A true war on poverty has to have a commitment. The state, that is the national government, has to take responsibility for full employment. No other entity in the economy has the financial capacity to guarantee full employment, only the national government. And then finally, how can the national government do it? He advocated employer of last resort. I'm going to be pretty brief. Just one more slide on it. His proposal was modeled on Roosevelt's New Deal jobs programs. What Minsky wanted was a universal job guarantee with a universal wage. So everyone in the program would get the same wage. That wage would become the national minimum wage. It would take workers as they are, where they are. So in other words, you don't have to get educated and skilled first. We will employ you, and then you will get skills while you work. And you would create jobs in every community so that you would not have to move to take a job. And then finally, the national government would pay the wages. The projects could be more decentralized. They wouldn't have to be run by the national government, just funded by the national government. Okay. The way that Minsky viewed capitalism is that capitalism is a financial system. This might seem too obvious to state, but most approaches to economics, if they treat money at all, or the financial system at all, it doesn't really play any major role. Milton Friedman used to always say that we only add money to our model of the economy to determine price. Otherwise, it has no impact whatsoever on the economy. So we call that neutral money. Minsky's view is completely different. Capitalism is a financial system, so you can't describe the capitalist economy without studying its financial system. And he says that he learned this when he was a student studying with Paul Douglas. Douglas was a senator, a very important one at the time, but also he's half of the Cobb-Douglas team that created the production function that all of the economics students have studied. He said what he learned from Douglas is that a formal analytical tool. So just think of that as the mathematics you learn in economics explains little of what happens in the world. And that to be useful analytical tools have to be embedded in an understanding of the institutions, traditions, and legalities of the market. So you have to understand the institutions of the market, and in particular, financial institutions, to understand how the economy works. So he went on to say, a capitalist economy can be described by a set of interrelated balance sheets and income statements. The liabilities of the balance sheet are commitments to make payments either on demand, when a contingency occurs, or at specified dates. So the way Minsky is viewing the capitalist economy is it's a bunch of balance sheets. People have balance sheets. They have to service their liabilities. Okay, so that's what the economy is all about. It's about servicing your liabilities. You go into debt to buy assets. The assets give you a return. You've got to service your liabilities that you issued. In 1982, he published a book titled Can It Happen Again? What he's referring to is the Great Depression. Can we have another Great Depression? And his answer in 1982 was no, it can't. Although our system naturally creates instability, and from time to time, it's going to have financial crises, they can't degenerate into a Great Depression because we have the big government and the big bank that will intervene and stop the downfall. So we cannot go into a Great Depression. So he says, in a world where the internal dynamics imply instability, okay, that's the kind of world we live in, a semblance of stability can be achieved or sustained by introducing conventions, constraints, interventions, institutions like the big bank and the big government, okay? So to contain the evils that market systems can inflict. Notice again, this evil he's talking about, the tendency to instability, is within the system, but we can constrain it through institutions and authorities. Okay, and finally, the aptness of those institutions will determine the path of the economy through time. So this is going back to that early 1950s work that he did. So anyway, in 1982, his answer was, no, it cannot happen again. By around 1990, he began to change his view. And he started arguing, you know, maybe it could happen again. And the reason was because the institutions we put in place during the Roosevelt New Deal and immediately after World War II, he argued those institutions aren't up to the task anymore. They might not be good enough, okay? So he started to have some doubts. In 2007, we had a crash, okay? Minsky died in 1996, so a decade before it happened. When it happened, a lot of people said, oh, this is what Minsky was warning about, okay? The global financial crash. And so they called it a Minsky moment. And remember, just to summarize what his theory was, it was the financial instability hypothesis. It was about investment, about a transformation over the business cycle to Ponzi positions, and so on. Okay. So my view was, it's very nice that Minsky is finally getting the credit that he's due, but this analysis here is wrong. Okay. It doesn't take account of his work after 1990. When Minsky started to doubt that it couldn't happen again, he developed a different analysis. It was more of a stages approach. And I said, we should be looking at that work, not the early work, not the 1960s work, because the economy had changed. So anyway, if you look at the kinds of crises we had from 1980 on, the 1980s crisis was a thrift and savings and loan crisis. It had to do with commercial real estate. And then we had a bank crisis that had to do with developing country debt. Also in the 1980s, we had the Michael Milken junk bond crash, okay? In the 1990s, we had the new economy, NASDAQ, irrational exuberance crash. This was NASDAQ.com stocks. In the 2000s, we had the housing bubble with subprime mortgages, foreclosures, and all that. And also in the 2000s, we had commodity markets. So there are three things about these crises. First, they come more and more frequently. We had no crises from World War II until 1966. The 1966 crisis was very minor. We had another one in 1970, minor. These are increasingly frequent, and each crisis is worse than the one before. The last one in the 2000s was very serious, okay? So they get worse. The other characteristic is none of these are investment. None of these are firms borrowing to finance investment, okay? So they don't really fit the financial instability hypothesis, which is about financing investment. If we look at Minsky's work, really it began in 1989 until he died in 1996. He had gone back to his professor, Schumpeter, who also had a stages approach to capitalism. That capitalism goes through stages. And Minsky said, so we've gone through these four major stages of capitalism. In the 19th century, we had commercial capitalism. Now remember, capitalism is a financial system. And the point is, each one of these stages has a different kind of financial system. The capitalism of the 19th century was based on commercial banks. Commercial banks, it's a pretty simple business. They lend short-term to firms to finance working capital. So in other words, pay the wage bill, buy the inputs. Then we had the rise of finance capitalism. Finance capitalism is huge firms that need a lot of external finance to finance investment. So the kind of financial system you have is based on investment finance, and it is investment banks, not commercial banks. This is much riskier. Financing investment is a lot riskier than financing working capital. Okay, so we had the rise of finance capitalism, a different kind of capitalism, a much more unstable kind. It crashed in 1929. So the Great Depression was a crash of finance capitalism. And that was the end of it, because Roosevelt's New Deal replaced finance capitalism with a new kind of capitalism called, he used different terms, paternalistic, managerial welfare state capitalism. In Europe, it was called social democracy. So it's a system in which the government plays a much bigger role in the economy, where the government provides a safety net, but also it sort of manages the economy. So we came out of World War II with this kind. This was a very stable kind of capitalism. This is the kind of capitalism Minsky is analyzing in 1950s, 1960s, okay? But by the 1980s, we have the rise of a new kind of capitalism. He called it money manager capitalism. Many other people have also recognized we're in a new era in the 1980s, a new kind of capitalism. I think Minsky's analysis is the best one, so calling it money manager capitalism. So his argument was that the stability of the post-war period bred instability. Okay, we already went through that. It led to the accumulation of huge amounts of financial assets and financial liabilities. Debt ratios grow tremendously, all kinds of debts, okay? We have the rise of globalization of finance, banks operating across borders, international finance. We have the rise of securitization, which is a particular kind of finance in which you take a whole bunch of loans, you package them all together into a security, and you get them off your balance sheets. So the banks no longer held loans. Globalization and securitization are linked because if you can turn all loans into securities, you can sell those all over the world. So effectively what happens is US debts get held everywhere in the world. And what that means is if the US has a financial crisis, it will be a global financial crisis because our debts are held by everybody. Even the Bank of China was holding securities based on US home mortgages, okay? And finally, self-supervision. It wasn't just that we got rid of regulations. We told the biggest financial institutions to supervise themselves. So the government's not going to regulate them anymore. They're going to regulate themselves, okay? I have just a couple of slides of data. I'm not going to go through them in detail. I just want to give you a visual picture of what's going on. In this graph, you can see the share of all the assets that are held by financial institutions shifting from commercial banks. They used to have 60% of all financial assets, plus thrifts, which was the savings and loans that had a crisis in the 80s, and they've almost disappeared. But you see their share going from about 75% of all assets to 25% of all assets. So they shrink, become much less important. What grows? Well, managed money. What Minsky meant by managed money, it's funds that are under the management of professional money managers. Pension funds are the biggest category and a good example. So we have the growth of pension funds over the whole post-war period, and every pension fund has to have a money manager try to get the best possible returns. So that grows, that becomes the biggest part, managed money, and then a wide variety of other things, okay? The term that a lot of people use is shadow banks. So the shadow bank sector of the economy grew tremendously. And the point is, this is almost completely unregulated. And it also doesn't have the government standing behind it. The banks used to have regulation, and government stood behind them if they failed. The other part of the system, the shadow bank, doesn't. So it's a risky part. It's not regulated. And if it gets in trouble, there's no government guarantee standing behind it. So what we had was a growth of the financial sector and riskier behavior. So the financial sector starts grabbing more and more of the profits. They layer debt on top of debt. So financial institutions take positions in assets. They buy assets by issuing liabilities to other financial institutions. Let me go back. I wanted to point out one thing, which is the, oh, sorry. No, it's on the next slide. I'll show it in just a second. This one shows the share of corporate profits that go to the financial sector. In the early post-war period, the financial sector is getting 10 to 15% of corporate profits. They're getting 40% of corporate profits. Just before the global financial crisis, they accounted for 10% of value added. They double their share of value added. So what's happened is that the financial sector is becoming more and more important in the economy. And this is the slide I wanted to show. The total amount of debt relative to GDP is growing rapidly in the post-war period, and especially after 1990. This shows the debt to GDP ratio for the United States. everybody always talks about government debt, and you can see that it actually was not growing in the early post-war period. It's shrinking because it's not that the government's paying off the debt, it's that the GDP is growing. The denominator is growing. So it actually is shrinking. But what is growing is especially this one, private finance. Now, corporate debt is growing, household debt is growing, but the one that really grows a lot is private finance. This is the debt on debt. This is the shadow banking sector that owes other financial institutions. This is where the global financial crisis started, in this part of the economy. Okay, well, all of this growth of debt, especially after 1990, is going on. We have the Fed not only backing up the financial institution when crises occur, but also minimizing the danger. Bernanke in 2004 wrote a famous paper before he became the head of the Fed, arguing we've entered the era of the great moderation, where all the risks have been reduced. The Fed continually argued that there is no housing bubble. Everything is okay. So in 2004, making these kinds of arguments right before the economy goes into the global financial crisis. The reality is that we have the biggest debt, equity, commodity, and real estate bubbles in US history, probably in human history. But it had all been propped up by the big government and the big bank that are ready to intervene whenever necessary. When we had the global financial crisis, the Fed mostly intervened to bail it out. And the Fed had to spend and lend a total of 29 trillion in order to deal with that global financial crisis. In response to that crisis, we bailed them out. Reforms were promised, but no major reforms took place. So that the institutions, for the most part, just go back to doing what they had been doing. And so I say it probably will happen again. Okay, just to finish up. At the Levy Institute, Minsky started this project back in around 1990 of trying to promote reform. And he argued, if we're going to try to reform the economy to promote what he calls capital development of the economy, we have to understand the nature of our economy. We have to understand capitalism is a financial system, that neoclassical economics, that is the mainstream economics, is not useful because it has various theorems that tell us that finance doesn't matter. Third, the financial structure has become much more fragile, and that makes it likely that either stagnation or a deep depression has become possible again. A stagnant economy won't promote capital development of the economy. By capital development, he included human capital, education, training, and so on. But that could be avoided by act reform of the financial structure. So if we're going to reform capitalism, we have to reform the financial part of the capitalist system. So what did he want to do? Government has to play a bigger role. We need to reduce concentration. We need to force banks to hold more of their risks instead of packaging everything together and securitizing and selling it off. We need to have a public role in the capital development of the economy. So he wanted partnerships between the public sector and private sector. The government has to play a bigger role in re-regulating the system, re-supervising, and a role for the government for direct provision of financial services. Just as an example, if we're going to base college education on student loans, the government should directly provide the student loans rather than having them go through the private sector. But Minsky advocated lots of different kinds of provision of financial services by the federal government. Okay. We also have to have a return of active fiscal policy. Government needs to play a bigger role in the economy. Now, we got some of that with the COVID relief. So we have seen the government taking a more active role in the economy after this last crisis. Government can afford to buy anything for sale. It can always achieve full employment. It can always enhance economic stability, such as the relief checks that went out. It can enhance financial stability. And the way to achieve full employment is through the employer of last resort program, what we now call the job guarantee program. So to conclude, what do we learn from Minsky? First, Minsky always argued the Great Depression represented a failure of a particular kind of capitalism, finance capitalism, that had a small government and that relied on laissez-faire free market economy. That failed. The New Deal, we created a new kind of capitalism with a big bank, big government model. It was very successful. The problem is success, stability breeds instability. And the instability was enhanced by deregulating institutions. What we should have done is change the regulations. Regulations were not useful anymore. And so we dropped them. What we should have done instead was created new ones. The current crisis, now I was talking about the global financial crisis, but we're in another one, repudiates the big government. We kept a big government, but we had a neoconservative, it's now more often called neoliberal model that favored self-supervised markets and socializing the risks when things go bad. So what we really need is a new deal based on full employment, shared prosperity, regulated and downsized financial sector. These are the kinds of things that if Minsky were still alive, I think he would be advocating. So I will stop and take questions.
Thank you. So we always start with the same question for each of our guests. And the first question is, are you a capitalist?
Have you had any capitalists?
I'll tell you how some others have answered. It'll surprise you. It surprised me.
Can't find a pen. Anyway, go ahead.
No, go. You have to give us your.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell me first. Well, look, a capitalist has to exploit labor, and I don't have any means to do that. So I can't be a capitalist.
So, yes, so one of the students just turned around and said to me that your answer is similar to the first guest speaker we had, who it will not surprise you to know was Matthew Forstatter. So it's such an interesting question for us because on the first day of the semester, I posed the question to each of the students in the class, and many of them answered the question as if it meant, well, because it's what it meant to them. Do you essentially agree with or believe in capitalism? Are you supportive of a market economy or the idea of freedom or free markets? So students wrote really interesting things. Mark Blythe said, we're all capitalists because we all sell our data to someone. So we're all owners and sellers. Now I was very surprised. Who else? What other answer? Oh, I asked Jamie Galbraith, instead of asking Jamie, are you a capitalist? He focused his remarks on his father's work. I said, was your father a capitalist? And what did he say? He said he was a New Dealer, is how he answered the question. So it's just interesting whether someone goes to that fundamental relationship to the ownership of capital, or whether one thinks of the question in terms of how receptive you are or supportive you are to this economic system called capitalism.
Okay, well, first I would say there's no such thing as a market economy. None has ever existed, none ever will exist. There is such a thing as a capitalist economy, but as Minsky said, there's 57 varieties. Probably there's one out of the 57 that I would support. I'm waiting to see it. I think the New Deal does come close. I think I'm with Jamie. That version of capitalism, if it had done a better job of including women and people of color, people with disabilities, and so on, it would be closer to one that I would support. So I think it had many failures too, but far fewer failures than the other 56 versions.
You know, because Forstatter, of course, studied with Heilbronner, and Heilbronner studied with Schumpeter, and you studied with Minsky, and Minsky studied with Schumpeter. And so the students have, you know, familiarity with Schumpeter's work. How, just listening to you go through Minsky for the last hour or so, I don't think that you all probably feel much of a flavor of Schumpeter in this, right? The idea that what you kind of want is to create institutions that are effective enough to stabilize the economy, right? Whereas Schumpeter, as you heard, said every once in a while you need a good cold, let's say, shower, and you let the system flush itself out, and so you need to endure that period of instability to cleanse the system. And so I'm just wondering if you'll say something about how much of Schumpeter's own ideas stuck with and resonated with Minsky, and do they show up in his work?
Well, I think there's a lot. So one is stages approach, another is innovations. But I can tell you, when you walked into Minsky's office, the first thing he would tell you to read is chapter 3 of Schumpeter. He said, if you want to understand money, you have to read that chapter. And so what that chapter is all about is the role of the bank as the F-or, that's not a dirty word, E-P-H-O-R, the F-or of capitalism. That is the way Minsky looked at it too. So the banker holds the key. If you don't have access to a bank, you can't become an innovator, because innovators are different from just plain capitalists. They have a new idea, and so they don't already have the revenue to finance their new idea. So they've got to go to get the finance of the new idea. That's the role of the banker in Schumpeter's view. And that's what Minsky was also pointing to, that in a way the banker is sort of the regulator of the capitalists. That can go too far. I would say, Wall Street's role now is far too much of a regulator. Even just the pandemic related problems we're having now has a lot to do with the role of Wall Street in building mega corporations and global supply chains that are causing a lot of our problems right now.
What about questions? Yep, wait, let me get up and spin back. So you can see who's asking.
I was wondering what Minsky's thoughts on socialism were, because I remember when we read Schumpeter, he said that socialism could work. So I was wondering if Minsky held that same thought.
When he was younger, Minsky was a democratic socialist, I would say. He was involved in probably the most left-wing of the democratic left in California when he was at Berkeley. I think he would proudly say that his parents met at a convention, a Marxist convention, but he was proud to say they were Mensheviks, not Bolsheviks. So he was sympathetic, not to Bolsheviks, but to democratic socialists. He, I think he worked with democratic socialists in Germany. He was in the army, and in the post-war period, he played a role in reconstruction of Germany, working with democratic socialists. And then much later in his life, his close Italian friends were members of the Democratic Socialist Party. Okay, now that probably is not what you mean by socialism. It's sort of the equivalent of the far left of the Democratic Party in the US.
Huh?
So in one of your interviews, I think it's Rethinking the State, you talk about how currency is driven, and in the United States is driven by income tax. Do you think there's a better way to drive our currency other than income tax?
Well, see, we make a distinction between the initial driver when you want to start a new currency. If you have an economy that's not monetized, an income tax won't even work. Okay, so if when the colonists tried to colonize Africa, so Matt Forstater probably talked about this, an income tax is not going to work because they have everything they need. So why would they work to get money so that they could pay a tax? It would make no sense. The US obviously is thoroughly monetized. So you need an income to live in America. So income taxes work. Progressive, I think we should have a much more progressive income tax. But, if you thought about, is there something that would work that could be progressive, achieve some other goals? I've advocated a cubic feet of dwelling space tax. Okay, why? So from Matt Forstater, you probably heard of the hut tax. Well, everyone needs a hut. Everyone needs a dwelling space. So that will drive a tax. Why cubic feet? Because it's a proxy for your footprint on the environment, right? You got to heat it, you got to cool it, you got to use the construction materials and so on. So it's an environmental tax too, okay? Somewhat of a joke, but I'm also somewhat serious about it. I think we could supplement the income tax with some kind of a tax like this. You need to, of course, give exemptions for people who use solar power and so on. recycled materials. You can give exemptions for all of that so that you can still promote conservation. So that would be an alternative. As far as, one of the big purposes of a tax is to withdraw demand to release resources for things like the Green New Deal. For that, you need a very broad-based tax that will reduce demand on resources. If you could figure out how to make a consumption tax progressive, that would release resources. Okay. The problem is it's hard to get those progressive because high income people consume a small fraction, low income people consume all of their income. So you have to give exemptions to reduce the burden on low income people. So for that reason, the broad-based income tax that's highly progressive is a very good tax. So I think you weigh all the alternatives, it is the best one we've got. And then you can give an exemption, say anyone under 50,000, any family under $50,000 pays no income tax. Then you've dealt with low income, you make it highly progressive. We've heard of high income surcharges. So very, very progressive Democrats, wealth tax, surcharge, none of those are high enough. At the top end, I would have 120% income tax. So when I say progressive, I mean very progressive. Take more than all at the very top. That will helps to solve the inequality problem. And
Forstater talked about, Hume and Locke and Adam Smith, so that we really didn't hear from him on this topic. Did we hear from anybody who talked about Henry George at any point? Did someone talk about George and Alen? Okay, yeah, we haven't really done anything on this.
Okay. Mine is sort of a version, except his is on the land. Mine is on the dwelling. Yeah.
Other questions? Go ahead. Repeat customer.
Do you think there's a reason why like the real estate market is a source for a lot of economic depressions or like economic recessions?
Well, so there's quite a bit of evidence that our business cycle is a housing cycle. Ed Leamer, who's a very mainstream economist, econometrician, had a paper where I think he used at least a dozen different methods to get at this question, and all of them came out the same. Our business cycle is a housing cycle. And so there's definitely something to that it is a real estate cycle. In recent years, it's because that securitized asset, home mortgages are all securitized. They become a financial asset. And there's a huge incentive for the mortgage brokers to dupe people into taking on mortgages they can't afford. Okay, so that has two effects. One is that the prices of the houses they buy are boosted. So let's say, an honest banker would say, given my income, the most expensive house I can possibly afford to buy is $250,000 with the going interest rates and so on. But the banker knows that if they can get me into a $350,000 house, it's riskier, and they can get a better price for that mortgage that's going to go into security. What they will do is get me to take on a mortgage I can't possibly afford. Okay, so two things have happened. The house price is boosted because more people can afford expensive houses. And then second, the mortgages are very risky. And there's a pretty good probability there's going to be problems. Those two things combined mean you're going to have a bursting of the housing bubble. And what I just described is exactly what they were doing from 2004 through 2006. And it led to the global financial crisis. So I would say, how do you solve that problem? That is pretty easy to solve. Eliminate securitization, make it illegal, and go back to the old way of doing mortgages. Make it illegal for moderate to low income people. I don't care what rich people do, okay? Securitize their mortgages, I don't care. But for average Americans, let's give them good, safe mortgages at thrifts, savings and loans. Before 1974, homeowners virtually never defaulted on mortgages, and thrifts never failed. So it worked. It was very safe. Go back to that model. It worked.
So you would get rid of like the entire kind of packet system that the housing market is based on.
And require banks and thrifts to hold their loans. Can't sell them. That makes them do underwriting. This was also Minsky's position. I had a slide in there. I took it out to save time.
You want to say anything about what the Fed is poised to do with interest rates? And, we talked a little bit on Tuesday about, and you did as well, about sort of hedge and speculative and Ponzi, and seems like, we might be in a situation where so many large corporations are turning out, it's record profits every time there's an earnings report. They're reporting a new record. Margins are up. Does that suggest to you that, a tightening cycle doesn't carry the same kinds of risks in terms of pushing speculative firms into a Ponzi position because they've got enough cushion to sort of weather that?
Yeah, it's it's hard to get really good data on corporate debt, but they're probably very very highly indebted. So it's a problem. Now this time consumers are in much better shape than you would think. And that's the relief checks. The saving rate went to 26% after the first round of relief checks. So there's a lot of accumulated saving among the households. But we've been in a housing bubble and house prices are very high. A lot of people have taken out big mortgages. So yeah, it's possible. What we learned last time is it takes a while for the crash to come. So the Fed started raising rates in 2004. We started to crash in late 2007. So what I'm saying is don't expect it to happen this year, next year. It could take a while. On the other hand, I would just make the case there is no reason to raise interest rates. Dimitri and I have a paper up at Levy if students are interested on criticizing the way the Fed thinks. And Yeva and I have one that comes up that will be up by next week, actually looking at what causes our high inflation right now And to make a long story short, there is nothing going on that is causing inflation that rate increases is going to cause inflation to come down. Our inflation is due to OPEC. It's due to the shelter component of housing in the CPI, and it's food. People do not borrow to go grocery shopping. They don't borrow to fuel their car. And the shelter component is based on rent. People also don't borrow to pay rent. So raising rates is not going to get them to spend less on any of the items that is causing inflation to go up. It can't possibly help. And there is the danger that it could cause a financial crisis.
Yeah, I listened, I don't know how many of you did, we talked about it on Tuesday, to the State of the Union address. Did any of you listen that evening? So some of you sort of listened, yeah. One of the things that President Biden took credit for is a huge drop off in the fiscal deficit. He's saying these are the biggest declines in the deficit we've ever seen, $1 trillion. We're on course to reduce deficits by $1 trillion. So you've got fiscal tightening already happening at a really rapid clip. And you've got 40 million student loan borrowers, people with student loan debt, who for the last 2 years, most of whom haven't made a payment for 2 years. It's been on pause. And that's all starting up again in a few weeks. Those payments are coming back and you're going to be expected to make those payments. That is deficit reducing as well. And of course, it's income that you won't have to spend on other things. You'll be paying back the federal government. So it's another kind of tightening, but at the same time, we've got to act against inflation. And the tool that we're going to rely on is interest rate increases. The president is talking about trying to help Americans bring down their costs, right? He kept saying, we want to reduce your costs, I feel you're paying. But if the Fed is tightening, well, your credit card payments are going to go up for the things you do borrow to pay for. So your credit card payments are going up. Your student loan payments are starting back up. When the Fed raises interest rates, it means the government is actually going to spend more on servicing public debt. So those payments will increase. So there are all of these, gas pedal and brake pedal sort of things happening. And at the end of the day, we'll have to wait and see whether the headwinds overcome the kind of tailwinds that have kept the recovery going, and we actually end up with a recession. That's already a risk in Europe, and a legitimate risk, depending on how far things go here. Other questions?
The relief, it was all gone a quarter ago.
Yeah.
And taxes have taken out everything that was put in.
It's as if he forgets that the budget outcome is largely a reflection of what's happening in the real economy. And as the economy has recovered from the pandemic and the recession, naturally it is, reducing the amount of spending the government does to support a weak economy through, unemployment insurance and food stamps and housing assistance and a whole variety of programs that are there for people. If you qualify, the government will spend more to provide support. These are called automatic stabilizers. And as people get jobs and wages are increasing and incomes go up, then tax revenues increase. And both of these things help to bring the deficit down automatically, right? In a good way. It's shrinking because the economy is improving. And so to stand up and on the one hand, take credit for it, it's a good thing, because if you're presiding over an improving economy, the deficit will come down on its own, but you don't need to layer on a commitment on top of that to taking proactive steps, right? To raise taxes by more than you intend to spend, which is what the president pledged to do. So we'll go out and get more tax revenue than we'll spend, and this will help reduce deficits longer term. Well, that has the potential to tap that gas, I'm sorry, the brake pedal and slow the economy back down.
So him being proactive can actually hurt the economy instead of helping.
Yeah. Along with what the Fed is preparing to do.
Yeah, I don't always like it when politicians blame like individuals instead of looking at like corporations that have a much bigger impact, in my opinion. Like, I find that same issue kind of with environmental policy, like you need to reduce your own waste instead of like a big corporation or government who really makes the impact in terms of that. So I disagree with them on that point of the city.
Well, let's say thank you one more time.
Thank you.
And will you share, did you share your slides with me? So did you share your slides with me so that I can post them on Blackboard? Or would you if you haven't? Okay. We're gonna have Rick Wolf next week. So that'll be a fun one. And then we're gonna have Nick Hanauer. You know, Nick, Pitchfork Economics, the venture capitalist.
I recognize the name.
Yeah, so I think he's going to answer the, are you a capitalist question in the affirmative. We'll see. Thank you for doing this.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.